This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 40 of Here's How. Property rights are considered almost sacred in Irish law, not to mention in the Constitution. But what about the rights of tenants? Is the public good served by having such an imbalance of power between tenants and landlords? A new group doesn't think so. Listen on.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
On the line now, I have Mick Byrne. He is from the Dublin Tenants Association. Mick, what is the Dublin Tenants Association?
The Dublin Tenants Association is about tenants coming together to fight for our rights to decent and affordable housing. So we support each other with the small battles that we have, like challenging rent increases and so on, but we also want to create a movement of tenants that can change the policies and the structures that prevent us from having a right to housing at the wider level.
And does that refer specifically to tenants of private landlords as opposed to like local authority tenants?
Yeah, we work with tenants in the private rented sector in relation to all the issues they can experience, from illegal evictions, minimum standards, unaffordable rents, and we support tenants in particular to take cases against landlords to the PRTB.
Okay. I saw on social media you were promoting yourselves with a campaign that just highlighted some of the problems that people who were living as tenants, some of the problems they had from their landlords. Can you give me a couple of examples of those?
Yeah, well, we organised the hashtag Rent Rip-Off campaign in conjunction with our submission to the Dáil Committee on Housing and Homelessness, which is due to report to government tomorrow as it happens. And we asked tenants to share their stories on social media to highlight the extent of the problems and the anger of tenants. And we got dozens of stories from people taking part, with stories of 70% rent increases, illegal evictions, woeful standards of accommodation, damp, mould, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we also had people sharing stories of more, particularly problematic relationships with landlords harassing tenants, entering houses when they want to, this type of behaviour, which is quite common.
Did any stories stand out to you in particular?
Well, we had one story of a tenant who we'd actually worked with in the past in relation to our issue, who'd been sexually harassed by her landlord consistently and was eventually forced to move out of the house as a result.
One thing that I saw, and I'll come to it in a moment, but in your submission document, you made the point that somebody who lives in the same house as their landlord, who's maybe flat sharing, somebody's wanting to essentially get help paying the mortgage and they rent out a bedroom, those people don't even have the rights that tenants in Ireland do have. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you share a dwelling with your landlord, you're not considered a tenant in relation to the Irish legislation for the private rented sector, so therefore you don't get the protection that comes with that legislation, and you can't take a case to the Residential Tenancies Board, so you're left with almost no rights. And we routinely see people, in particular migrants, often women, being exploited in those scenarios, and when they come to us and find out that Irish legislation affords them no protection, they can't believe it, and it's a really distressing situation for people to find themselves in. And it's an example of, there's no possible justification for this kind of exclusion. If you enter into a contract with somebody in particular in relation to something as important as the right to housing, both parties should be protected. That's obvious.
Can you give any other examples of the type of things that tenants have to put up with in those circumstances?
Yeah, being told that you can't have friends over, being evicted for smoking, not inside the house, but even outside the house, not being able to control heating in the part of the house that you occupy, And of course, other stuff can crop up. Landlords, the same as everybody, can be, horrible people, and we have tenants come to us who end up renting from somebody who has an alcohol problem or a drug addiction problem, for example.
Mm-hmm.
That can be very threatening and scary, abusive, and so on. So you really get everything from just failure to meet the basic things that a landlord should be doing, such as adequate standard of accommodation and so on, right the way up to abuse and intimidation.
Would it be fair to say that those problems, they're not necessarily a subset of the problem of the cost and availability of rented accommodation, but they're an offshoot of it, in that if there was a good supply of relatively reasonably priced accommodation, nobody would have to put up with an alcoholic landlord who was abusing or harassing them and not letting them turn up the heat?
Yeah, certainly it's the case that the inadequate supply at the moment is increasing the vulnerability of tenants. There's no doubt about it. Having said that, I mean, if you look across Europe, most capital cities have pressures on their rental sector. It's the nature of contemporary cities that the rental sectors tend to be under a lot of pressure. There's very few cities where they can say that they have the supply where they'd like it to be, and as a result, you're always going to need very strong protection for tenants. Otherwise, abuses will happen.
Okay, well, those are the problems. What's the solution?
The two most important policy solutions that we need to see, and we need to see them immediately, are rent certainty and security of tenure. So security of tenure, specifically, as things stand currently, landlords have a wide range of possible ways through which they can evict tenants. First of all, they can evict tenants within the first 6 months of a tenancy for no reason whatsoever. That needs to be removed from the legislation. It's ridiculous. It has no justification, and it doesn't apply. Your bank can't change their mind about your mortgage 6 months into the mortgage. Local authorities can't change their mind about when they let one of their properties to a social housing tenant. So there's no justification for this in the private rental sector. In addition, landlords can evict tenants for when a family member of the landlord wants to use the property. That includes their cousins, their nephews, their aunties.
Yeah, it's incredibly widely drawn. It's like their girlfriend's nephew or something and it's obviously unenforceable. You'll find somebody in your family who you can pay €50 to put a sleeping bag there for a fortnight, and you can say, yeah, they occupied it after I kicked out the tenant.
Yes, it's very hard to enforce. And it's just nonsense. It's another example of how policy just doesn't treat the rental sector as a real source of housing, in the sense of as a mechanism for providing homes for people.
Do you think perhaps that our legislators are of the mindset that somebody who's renting is a student up in Dublin from the country for a couple of years while they're doing their degree in college or something, and that's the only phase in life that you would likely to be a tenant in a rented accommodation?
Yeah, there's a culture among legislators, amongst policymakers, and perhaps even among some members of the wider public, that if you don't own a property, you don't have a right to a home. That only homeowners that need to have a meaningful, fully protected home. If you're in a position where you have to rent your property, you basically should be willing to accept whatever is going. So there's a culture there of systematically excluding tenants in the private rented sector from the right to housing, and that is reflected in the legislation and in the policy. And one of the things that the Dublin Tenants Association has been established to do is to change that culture by showing that tenants are a really important part of Irish society. We make up 1 in 3 households in Dublin, and that we have the same need and the same right to a decent and affordable home as anyone else.
One thing that you mentioned in your submission, and I thought it was very accurate, is that security of tenure and in controlling rent increases are essentially the same thing, because if you have one without the other, you can effectively kick somebody out by giving them a huge and unrealistic rent increase, and you can effectively increase the rent by threatening to kick them out if they don't pay it.
Yeah, exactly. They go hand in hand, and they're both things that are desirable, and we would more or less take them for granted in other aspects of the housing system. If social housing rents were increasing by 30% per annum for the last few years, people would see that as a massive problem. If people's mortgage payments were increasing by 30% every year, you can be sure to be political outcry about it. So knowing what you're going to be paying for your housing over the medium term at the least is obviously a prerequisite to having a stable housing system. And similarly, knowing that you won't lose your home unless you don't pay your rent or engage in some kind of behavior that's problematic or whatever is also a prerequisite of a stable housing system. And
sure.
They work together.
This is coming towards the idea of rent certainty, and I want to explore that a bit with you. And it feels a little bit to me that obviously, as we know, rent controls were ruled by the Supreme Court quite some time ago to be unconstitutional. Do you get the feeling that rent certainty is sort of a workaround, putting a different name on effectively the same thing?
No, I don't think so. I mean, on the one hand, rent certainty is constitutional, so it is a workaround in that sense. But I think the key difference is that rent controls, during the post-war period, not just in Ireland, but in most European countries, would have tended to fix rents. Whereas when people talk about rent certainty, they're talking about a controlled or regulated increase of rents, and that's widely viewed by policy experts, people like Lorcan Surr from DIT, for example, to be the most appropriate way to provide affordable housing.
That may be the case, but you would agree, I'm sure, that if rents are set in the free market, as effectively they are now in Ireland, they will reach a particular level. Rent controls or rent certainty are both designed to effectively ensure that the rents are lower than they would otherwise be in a free market. Isn't that the case?
Yes, usually, yeah.
I'm just wondering, if you have rent certainty, as you put it, or rent control, or effectively forcing the rent to be lower than the market level, isn't it likely that those market prices will find their way out in a different way? That if somebody has a good or a service that would command a particular price in the market, you're going to have negative effect if they're forced to sell those goods or services for less than the market price.
Well, I disagree, and I don't think that there's any evidence to suggest that that's the case. Well, I mean, you're not talking about preventing people from making a return on investment in private rental accommodation. You're just talking about ensuring that return is kept within certain limits and that it's regular and predictable, because we're not talking about we're talking here about housing, which is a basic need and a right that no one can live without. We can't simply abandon that to the completely incoherent and chaotic reality of the Irish housing system, with its chronic incompetence in both the banking sector and the development sector. That has failed. That model has failed demonstrably.
What I'm thinking of is that, and I noted that in your submission you mentioned rent controls and you specifically cited Berlin, and I've been in Berlin a lot. And one of the things that I've noticed are notices that people put up at the notices in supermarkets or taped up to lampposts, and roughly translated they say a reward that, and it can be 500, 600 euro I've seen, if somebody finds for the advertiser a place to rent in that area, they will pay a reward. And the reason why that's happening is, of course, if you had a free market, that rationing, because there's a lack of housing, that rationing would be done by increasing prices. And the result of the very strict rent controls that do exist in Berlin is that you have very often people who are the official tenant who sublet to a second person at the market rate, unofficially, who is desperate to get somewhere to rent and not motivated to report this. And it's even known to happen that you can have 3 or 4 or 5 sub-letters, each of them taking a cut on the rent. Are you sure that it's just given human nature that it's possible to force the market price down below what it would otherwise be?
Of course it is. I mean, of course it is, and it's something that we take for granted in many other in relation to many other things that we can't live without. For example, healthcare and health insurance or education.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, when we think housing is something that I think what you have to understand is that people are becoming homeless and many more people's lives are in chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason they're in chaos is because the government has no mechanisms to ensure that the private rented sector actually consists of housing that we can live in.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't have those mechanisms, what we have is individual landlords making more or less random decisions about rent levels, about the quality of accommodation, and so on and so forth. That's leading to chaos. That's what it's leading to.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what kind of free market utopia you have experience of, but the reality is that in Dublin and in all cities that have unregulated private rental sectors, they're characterised by chaos, and the private rental sector is a major avenue for homelessness. In cities that have regulated rental sectors and rent certainty, they have the highest quality rental accommodation in the world, and they have the most affordable rental accommodation in the world. That's a fact.
Another solution that has also been promoted, and we may get to it in a later podcast, another solution has been forcing people who are hoarding either land or vacant properties to put them on the market. So, for example, in Dublin, there are hundreds of acres of empty derelict sites that the owners view as more advantageous to keep off the market, appreciating and going up in capital value rather than actually building on. Don't you think it would be smarter to go down that route, to get more supply into the market? Because no matter how much you control the rent, that doesn't make any more houses, and it might actually reduce the number of houses if it was less profitable to build them.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Rent certainty is not a mechanism for increasing housing supply. So in addition to rent certainty measures, we're going to need other measures which increase the supply of housing, and that includes penalising land hoarding. I think you're absolutely right there, and I think it also includes increasing the supply of social housing. I think everybody knows that needs to happen. But fortunately, it's not an either or. I mean, we can set rent certainty at the level which we think is required to make rent affordable and to ensure the level of supply that we want to see as a society. But we also have many other mechanisms both to offset the impact of rent certainty on landlords, such as, for example, taxation measures that can offset any impact of rent certainty on landlords. Mm-hmm. And we have other mechanisms to increase housing supply, many of them. There's no real problem there. I mean, it's just a matter of the government moving away from the, ignoring housing, which is what it's been doing for the last 4 years, and starting to implement some of the measures which we've been debating about at this stage, for a couple of years. Everybody knows we need them. There is nobody who's involved in housing and homelessness who doesn't think that rent certainty is needed. Focus Ireland do, Threshold do, experts like Michelle Norris from UCD, Owen O'Sullivan from Trinity, Lorcan Sur from DIT, mm-hmm. organisations like the Dublin Tenants Association. We know that they're needed, we know that they can be delivered, and that's why it's crucial, not just to know what the solutions are, but to have a way of bringing tenants together so that we can have a voice, so that we can exert political pressure, and so we can stop allowing ourselves to be ignored by politicians and legislators.
One last thing, Mick. I can see in your submission you're talking about amending the Residential Tenancies Act, and one point that you've made is initial settings of rents to be calculated based on the nature of the property, size per square metre, location, standard, available amenities, etc. Don't you think that there's a lot of soft decisions in there? Isn't that a bit dangerous? The Irish Public Service hasn't shown itself to be very good at making good judgments of that type.
I think, yeah, so this is the type of a system that operates in the Netherlands, for example, where you have effectively a point system where each property can be awarded a certain number of points based on basically its quality, location, and so on. And that's used to moderate or to shape the setting of the initial rent for the property. I think, in terms of how well it can be introduced in Ireland, I think if the Department of the Environment or the Housing Agency or whoever isn't capable of developing such a system, then we probably have more to worry about, if you know what I mean. I know that there are concerns about the capacity of the Department of the Environment in relation to housing, and if we are going to tackle the housing crisis, there probably
Sure, no, but I'm thinking specifically, I mean, you mentioned the Netherlands. Do you think that business is done in Ireland with the same level of probity that it's done in the Netherlands? We've seen, for example, in planning applications, having a friend in the planning department is very, very useful. Do you think we could end up with two classes of either landlords or tenants who get a far more favourable decision depending on who they know?
To be honest with you, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's any huge cause for concern there. I mean, I don't think anything applies here that doesn't apply to every single other aspect of government regulation and legislation. You know what I mean? I mean, there's always going to be issues of, particular agendas shaping how policy is implemented. That's true for the health care. That's true for, state infrastructure and so on and so forth. So of course it will be something that is always going to be a concern and people should be wary of, but I don't think it represents a particular problem in relation to this piece of regulation.
Mick Byrne from the Dublin Tenants Association, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks, William.
Make your view heard. Record your own contribution and email it to podcast@here'show.ie. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
That's almost the end of episode 40 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 22nd of June 2016. There's links to the Dublin Tenants Association website and to their Facebook account with the social media campaign in the show notes on the website. If you can think of a topic that you think should be covered in the future show, or if you want to suggest someone to include, and that could be yourself, then let me know. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and give it a rating or even write a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook, follow the podcast on Twitter @Here's How Podcast, follow the Dublin Tenants Association on Twitter @Dublin Tenants, and subscribe to the podcast so any new shows automatically come up in your podcast feed. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software. If you don't know how to do that, there is step-by-step instructions along with contact details at www.here'show.ie. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.